across generations, the number one problem in estate planning is communication. And you see that in the data that comes from millennials as well, where 62% of millennials don't have a trust or a will. You have almost 40% of millennials who have never even talked to their parents about estate planning at all. They haven't even asked, hey, do you have a will, mom? Or do you have a will, dad? Like an estate plan is oftentimes only as good as what's been communicated to the next of kin and to loved ones. And the stickiest situations come from communication gaps where people have interpretations that are outside of the legal document themselves.
Welcome back to Love and Other Assets, the podcast for all things love and money. My name is Emily, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Plenty. My husband and I co-founded Plenty after we began merging finances and were shocked to find what a mess that could be. We'd both been in Silicon Valley working in fintech for over a decade each, so we set out to build something better. Today, Plenty is a wealth platform helping modern couples invest and plan for their future together. We bring the investment strategies and products of the wealthy to the everyday household. But we know in relationship is also not just about the products, it's also about the conversations. And talking about love and money is still pretty new. So that's what we set out to do in our podcast, to hopefully make it a little bit easier for everybody listening. Today, I'm very excited to talk about a topic that we know a lot of our couples think about: wills and estate planning. I'm excited to welcome Daniel, the co-founder and COO of Trust and Will, the leading online estate planning company. He oversees the executive team and daily operations and plans for the company's future. Previously, Daniel also led growth at 2 custom software companies and worked with funded entrepreneurs to design and develop mobile and web applications. He currently lives in Texas with his wife and 2 kids. Thank you so much for coming to the show, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
So I'm so curious, of all the things that you could have done after your experience working with so many different types of companies, what was your journey to deciding to start Trust and Will?
Yeah, it serendipity, I guess. What was happening was in my life and my co-founders' lives, we were going through life moments which made us think of adulting tasks. And similar to a lot of the tasks that you deal with a lot of your customers, right? And how do we think about finance and life and money? And then all of a sudden, this weird topic of estate planning got brought up. And between my co-founders and I, we asked ourselves, do you know how to do a will, or do you know how to do a trust? Nobody knew. And so then we started asking all of our friends and our families, where would you go to create an estate plan? And this is in 2017. Where you had a brand for everything online. If you wanted to invest, you knew where to go. If you wanted to do your taxes, you knew where to go. If you wanted credit card advice, there was a digital app for everything, and we couldn't think of one for estate planning. And so the more that we unpacked about the actual estate planning industry, the more we thought that there was room for an industry leading brand that became the default in the space. And so that's what we have been trying to do for a while. And when we first started, our investors were like, millennials don't do estate plans. And we had to ask them, well, when did you first do your estate plan? And they would all say, well, when we had kids or when we bought our first home. And I said, well, who's buying homes and who's having kids? And they were like, well, I guess we would call those millennials now. And so we built an estate planning platform for a digitally native customer, but we serve people of all ages, of all areas, and we're available in every state. And we've helped over 700,000 families now consider estate planning and start it through our platform. So we're really proud of what we built over the last 4 years.
That's incredible.
6 years.
That's incredible to hear. I think lots of parallels actually too, because for us ourselves, we looked at all these different products and we saw, wow, there's so many products built for managing money on your own. It's almost like this whole universe of financial products built for people in their early 20s. But wait a second, millennials are entering their 30s and 40s. How are there not products built for that stage of life and that reality that we all grew up? I'm curious too, for the life moments that catalyzed thinking about estate planning, were they house, baby, and or marriage? Some combination of those?
Yes. Yeah. So it's like the D's, death, divorce, are common ones for estate planning, but the most common one that we see overwhelmingly is becoming a parent.
Yeah. And millennials are becoming parents at the fastest rates than they ever have in these years. So it's a great place to be and a great time where lots of people do need support.
Yeah, and when we started the company, 3.5 million millennials were becoming new parents every year in 2017, and so that number has it's come down like a little bit because more millennials are having their second kid and their third kid now. The oldest millennial being, I think, the oldest millennial is 39 now, and so you like look at those stats and you're like, man, what do people do in their like late 20s to late 30s? They grow up, I guess.
Yeah. Get married, buy a house, have some kids, not to make everyone sound linear, but everyone has their own path to it. But generally, yes, it includes
Absolutely,
some of those moments.
yes.
Um, for your personal story, did you always think you would start a company one day?
I have wanted to be an entrepreneur my whole life. And part of that is because I come from kind of generations of entrepreneurs. My grandfather, I both of my like great grandparents came from Europe. And so they were German, they were Jewish, they were Italian. They came over, they all settled in Chicago, and they all figured out a way to build. And so my grandparents, my dad's dad and my mom's dad were both entrepreneurs, very different. One was an engineer, so very focused on tinkering and building things, and then the other was a he didn't go to college. He barely got through high school, but he knew how to sell. He was the Italian one, and so he built his own like business world as a business owner. And so I saw that growing up. And then my dad was an entrepreneur, and so he worked in manufacturing and electronics. And I just loved the idea that you could see something of value that you could bring to the world and do it, and you
Yeah.
could improve it, and it's all creativity. It's not like it's like you can become the kind of the solution that you see in the world. And so for my dad, that was like electronics, and so maybe he was like a distributor of audio devices to schools. So think about those. I don't know if you remember back in the day, those big headphones that we wore back in like elementary school, that you had to like plug in with one of those big fat plugs, not like
Hmm.
the modern plugs that went into like
Yeah.
weird devices. And you see those plugs now and you're like, what does this go to? A piano or something? So he sold those. And so,
Yeah.
so I had a lot of that, influence growing up. I looked up to those three men. I still do. I still look up to them. And so,
Yeah, I would say a lot of parallels as well. I grew up with my parents starting a company, and my grandparents had also started companies, and it felt like the more natural path until I realized it wasn't. But I
yeah,
feel like by that point, it was already too late. It was already what I've been so steeped in my whole life.
yeah.
I'm curious, if you could talk to your younger self, what's a piece of advice or something that you would want to say to, Daniel growing up, thinking about starting a company?
Hmm. That's a great question. And I saw this in the call notes and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to answer this question because I don't know a different path that could get me to where I am now. And I love what I'm doing now. I just love it. I love everything about my life. Like I love our company that we have. Like I love the culture we built. I love the fact that we help families day in and day out. I love our mission. I love our opportunity. It's like an absolutely massive market. And then on the personal front, like I'm married, I have kids, I have another baby on the way. Like I think life is just really, really good right now. And so if I go back and I mess with that timeline, I don't want to mess with it. But I will say like I was impatient in my 20s, like very impatient. And I think that impatience is what makes me a good entrepreneur in some ways, but I think that impatience also combined with like a little bit of ego made me not very great employee in my 20s, which eventually led me to being also an entrepreneur because I was like I could do this myself. And so I don't like even parts of it where they're like prickly and I look back and I'm like maybe I should advise him against that. I'm like, I don't know. Like I eventually learned, and sometimes you don't learn unless you go through the experience. And so I love the path that I've taken to get to where I'm at.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say definitely an impatience is such a common trait too, I think, with people who eventually do start companies, and so important to actually preserve. I think it's the fire behind so much of it.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, One of the things I'm really curious about is with Trust and Will, you have steeped yourself in truly understanding the needs of millennials, especially this digitally native audience, as well as also the world of estate planning. I know you also just released a study on it too. Can you give us a little bit of a highlight reel of some of the key insights you had from the report that you ran?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been releasing a study of millennials and estate planning for the last 4 years, and we do it as part of a broader data set where we have our proprietary data from the, all of the customers and our members who have gone through the platform, and then we also go out and we survey people who haven't used Trust and Will just to see like how accurate is our data versus others. Obviously, our data is people who have done it versus haven't, and like overwhelmingly across generations, the number one problem in estate planning is communication. And you see that in the data that comes from millennials as well, where 62% of millennials don't have a trust or a will. You have almost 40% of millennials who have never even talked to their parents about estate planning at all. They haven't even asked, hey, do you have a will, mom? Or do you have a will, dad? And so what ends up happening in the stickiest situations is it's a communication gap. Like an estate plan is oftentimes only as good as what's been communicated to the next of kin and to loved ones. And the stickiest situations come from communication gaps where people have interpretations that are outside of the legal document themselves. And that's where challenges come in. And that's where huge family fallouts come in. And like I've seen it at like a very like personal level in my extended family. And we've heard hundreds of these stories, probably thousands, because we help people set up their will and their trust-based estate plans for themselves and their loved ones. And then we also have a service that helps people through probate, which is the post-death process of settling an estate. And it's specifically the legal process that helps people gain authority to actually close out an estate, become the executor, and sell, compile, and distribute the assets. And so we hear gnarly stories on the probate side of the business, as you'd imagine. And what we're trying to do on the planning side is prevent that gnarly from happening, right? And to make and to help every family leave a legacy that can take the burden off of their loved ones, because nobody wants. So in that millennial study, that's like one of the main. That's like a core theme is like communication, and like everybody knows about the great wealth transfer. Not everybody, but most people. Like if you've read the New York Times in the last year, you've probably read about the great wealth transfer multiple times. Every financial institution is talking about it. And yet, even all of that, there's still this gap where people are like, they're planning for it. And so that's what we're trying to do. Like we're trying to increase awareness and increase execution of these like key documents that can increase this communication loop and can help help people leave that legacy, think long term, think multi-generationally. And I think if we do that well, I think the world's in a much better place.
And I have my own theories, but definitely I can understand why it's uncomfortable. Why do you think there is such a big gap in communication?
Inertia maybe is like inertia and comfort, right? Like very rarely do we increase inertia towards uncomfortable topics. And so estate planning, oftentimes you are required to increase inertia towards a direction that or have a hypothesis might be uncomfortable. And so also generational differences about money. I know you study these and you look at them all the time, and like millennials are more willing to talk about money than our parents' generation is. And so we're more open about it. We're more collaborative about it. So we're more likely to talk to our peers about what we're making or where we're investing or what's going on with our finances than previous generations are. So millennials feel comfortable with that, but it's never been brought up or modeled to us. And the amount of financial education that's been passed down generationally is very low, at least in all the studies that I've seen and we've done ourselves. And most people are like, my parents didn't teach me anything about money. That's like the overwhelming response when you ask a millennial, what did you learn about money from your parents? And they'll say, not much. And so now obviously that's the bell curve. There's people who are very educated, and then there's people who literally didn't get any. So I think inertia is a really big one. And I also think life in our generation has kind of been hit and hammered by multiple financial events that became like defining moments in the world. And so I think they're like this generation is just feeling a big squeeze financially, right? So like people were coming of working age around like the '08 recession, and then a decade later you hit a pandemic combined with like a massive market change and shift, right? Especially for like information workers. And now you're continuing to see that with what AI is doing. And so I think that like that delayed how millennials bought homes. It delayed how long until they had kids. And so for estate planning, we're seeing it accelerate because millennials kind of accelerated those life events in the last like 4 years, which is a delay. Everybody was expecting it more like 8 years ago.
Yeah. And one thing you talk about is some of the key changes in this generation. You mentioned also squeeze. I know something that we think a lot about is how more and more millennials are entering what we see as the sandwich generation.
Yeah.
I know you also mentioned that in the report. Can you help us understand what is the sandwich generation and what are some of the implications, especially when it comes to estate planning?
Yeah. Yeah. The sandwich generation is anybody who it's technically not an age. It's a life stage where you have kids in the home and you have aging parents at the same time. And so you're having to manage both sides of the spectrum. Oftentimes it means that you're going to, if you're not already, you're going to become a caregiver at the same time that you have kids in your home. And so you can imagine if you've had kids later. So, like my wife and I, we had our first kid when I was 31. Okay. And so then we had our next kid when I was 34. I got to do the math. Gosh, maybe it was 32, 34. I mean, we're going to have our third kid when I'm 36. Okay. And so if I do math, that means that like I'm going to have kids in my home until I'm 54. And my parents are 30 years older. And so they're going to be like into their mid 80s before my kids are out of my house. And so I will essentially be that sandwich generation for the, and probably not for the next 5 years. My parents are very young and they're active and they're out. They're going to eventually age, right? And so millennials, Gen X is like square in the sandwich generation right now. And so they like a mid to young Gen Xer would be like probably like right in the fairway of like what is considered the sandwich generation. And then it starts to be elder millennials are entering into that.
Yeah. I know one of the things that your report also mentions, and I wonder, if this is all tied up in that sandwich generation pressure, is that for millennials that you interviewed, they reported that it would take almost $525,000 in household income for them to be happy. Almost double, though, of what is the reality for many millennials. So one of the things that I thought really fascinating about the report was it called out 2 points. It called out that one, millennials thought it would take about $525,000 a year in income for them to be happy, almost double of what the average is. And also people expected far lower rates and dollar amounts in terms of inheritance than what is typically seen. What are your thoughts on kind of those two figures for how millennials feel, especially when it comes to being stressed about money right now?
Yeah, I mean, those feel very correlated to me, right? If you feel like you're not going to receive anything, then you have to provide for by yourself. And a lot of things have happened over the last decade, from specifically like inflation wise and a compression of wages that I think is being felt. And it's being felt in affordability of housing for millennials, and not just millennials, but everybody, but specifically most people buy their first home when they're 25 to 35 years old. And so that's that millennial generation. So you're getting a squeeze on housing, you're getting a squeeze on affordability. And I think that people are just looking at the numbers and saying like, man, it's going to take a lot more than I thought it was going to take. And so we're seeing that in the data. And so you combine that with a continually decreasing amount of expected inheritance, which is odd because baby boomers are expected to transfer an insane amount of wealth down. Okay. But there's a communication gap because now you have millennials who are going to be the recipients of the majority of wealth from the baby boomer generation will go towards millennials. And yet they're saying we're not really expecting that much. And so where is the great wealth transfer going to distribute to? Is it going to be spent before the generation passes away, or is it going to be passed along? And I think that's where communication comes in.
Yeah.
Talk to your parents. Ask them if they have a will, if they have a trust, what they plan to do with their assets. They could be young and spry and healthy, and that's not the point. It's not expecting them to pass away. We obviously don't want parents to pass away so we can get the inheritance. That's not the point of the conversation, but it's so you could plan appropriately and you don't have a missed expectation. Like if your parents are planning to spend everything before they pass away, you're going to want to know that. Right. And you're going to want to plan appropriately. If they're setting aside assets for you, whether it's like a home or retirement accounts or life insurance accounts, you're going to want to know that as well. So I just really encourage everybody to have those conversations with their parents and talk to them about estate planning and start to link that multi-generational thread together, because it leads to just a way better family situations when things get complicated, because you really don't ever know what's going to happen. And even if your parents are young and they're healthy, and like my parents are 67 years old, and my mom's playing tennis all the time, and my dad rides his bike all the time, and they're very healthy, and but you just don't know.
Right. And one thing that's also fascinating, especially in a world where it is this big communication gap with millennials and their parents, it seems like also potentially millennials are running into their own life milestones and thinking about estate planning for themselves, potentially before even having had that conversation with their parents. I know for, at Plenty, there's 2 life milestones that we see very consistently as a catalyst for people to really start to think about, I need you to have visibility. I need you to know where all of accounts are. And that's typically around buying a house and having kids. I'm curious, is that also what you're seeing on the estate planning side?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. The number one reason that people create an estate plan is because they have kids. And it's oftentimes the second kid and not the first kid. And I think it's because having your first kid is overwhelming. And then finally they get their legs under them by the second kid. And oftentimes if they're going to have another kid, then they might even delay it more. And they say, well, I'll do it after we have our third kid. But I think being a parent long enough, you think about what could happen to you and what might happen to your kids, that by the time you have kid number 2, you're like, I should really do this. And then it's buying a house. So then if you have kids and then you buy a house, now you have assets and you have kids. And so it just starts to kind of compound on itself, like the reasons that you actually do need to plan, and you need to plan appropriately. So absolutely, it's milestone based.
Yeah. And one thing that I thought that was really fascinating was when I was reading this, I actually didn't expect that so many of the people who are your customers at Trust and Will are in that net worth range between $125,000 and $500,000. That's actually very similar to kind of the stage that we work with couples to, which is right when you get to the point where you're meaningfully starting to put money aside too. I am curious though, because sometimes in, the estate planning world, especially the trust world, sometimes with the will world as well, there's a reputation that, it's for when you already have a lot of money or you're already very wealthy. What are your thoughts on that?
So go back to the life milestones. And so when you have a kid, so the will does 2 things. It doesn't just talk about your assets. It does more than 2 things. It talks about your assets and where it goes, also assigns guardianship for your kids, and then it gives you your final arrangements. And so what we oftentimes find is that as parents with young kids, they might not have a ton of assets, but they do want to assign guardianship for the kids. And if they're going to assign guardianship, they're also going to be planned for the assets. Okay. And so we used to have a product that just did guardianship. It made setting guardianship for the kids really easy. And it was 4 questions and people could have the doc. And what we realized is that at the end of that, we said, would you like to create a full will? And by the time they got to the end of that, 80% of people were just saying, yeah, I'm here. I'll just do the full will. And so then we actually got rid of our guardianship product altogether, because we're like, if they're going to do it, they might as well just do the whole thing. And so I think that's why you get people in in those segments. I also think that the idea that somebody else or specifically probate court makes decisions for your assets, even if you don't have a lot of assets, I don't think that's the desire of most people. And so, and assets are not just physical assets now, right? They're now your digital assets. And so you have an executor of your estate, and then you also have a digital executor, and they're oftentimes the same. And all of our wills have a built-in digital executor function to them. And so then you start to think like, Well, if I didn't have this, then it's like, then who's going through my emails and my text
Yeah.
messages and my Facebook DMs and and early on at Trust and Will, like I was in a different life stage than my co-founders. They were married or getting married, and I had just started dating, and I was like, this is a thing, like digital assets. Like I don't want people, scrolling through my phone and and seeing what's going on. And so like I think that the younger generation, they actually have like an increasing awareness and an increasing desire for privacy for their digital assets, because a lot of their life is online. And you see that in a difference between Gen Z and millennials. And it comes out in our study as well, where
Yeah.
Gen Z is about twice as likely to want to have a digital executor who like shuts down all their stuff. And because again, that's a lot more of their asset picture. It's what their life is like online. And millennials definitely have that. And so like millennials, so like you have, so there's this desire of defining what assets are. Assets fit into that category. And so that's why you see a range of net worths. But you also see in that study that once you drop below 125K, it drops off pretty significantly. And so I do believe that there is a minimum threshold where people start to think about their assets. And we see that threshold somewhere around 50K. And then it ramps up pretty significantly once you get above 100K in assets. And a lot of times the thing that's getting people above the 100K at the beginning is a home purchase.
Yeah.
And so that would be considered a full asset that's fully probatable. And it's not probatable on the amount that you have paid in mortgage or your down payment. It's actually on the full asset value. So if you have a $300,000 home and you pass away and you've only paid off, let's say $30,000 on it, and your full value of it gets assessed at probate court in order to be distributed to next of kin.
So one of the things that you mentioned too was how it was answering 4 questions to get up and running originally for the guardianship experience. What is the current experience for a customer? How easy is it to set up a will today?
It is remarkably easy. You can do it before by the time you watch a stand-up comedy show on Netflix, right? You'll be done with your estate plan. I was sitting next to somebody on the plane the other day who didn't have an estate plan, but they had their computer out, and I was like, hey, and they literally, it's a mom of 3, and she was like, I don't have one. I know I need to have one. I was like, okay, pull out your computer. I was like, you're going to complete this before this flight ends, okay? And a flight is even too long. I'm talking like a sit. So our product, we wanted to make it approachable, easy, affordable. You can get through it end to end. If you're doing the will and you know the answers to your questions, 20 minutes. The trust might take a little bit longer. There's some asset questions in there. And so you're looking at like less than an hour. You don't have to go to an attorney's office. You don't have to talk to anybody, although we have amazing customer support that's available at any time. We also have an attorney network who you can set up calls with if you want like more expert or refined professional advice. And but like, if you know the answers to the questions, like where your kid's going to go, how are you going to split assets up, what are your final arrangements, who do you want to be your medical power of attorney, et cetera, the process is easy. The hardest part for people is answering the questions, not the software. Our website makes it as easy as possible. We can't pick a guardian for people, and we can make recommendations for most common final arrangements, but we're probably not going to recommend like Uncle Bob as your guardian for your kids. So the product itself is incredibly easy, and I think that's why we have such a high acquisition rate, and the numbers of people who start and who finish are remarkable.
Yeah. And to give a sneak peek, let's say we have a couple who just had their first child. What are some of the questions that they would have to answer as part of coming up with their will?
Yeah, so we divide it into 4 sections, and they're super easy sections. It's your basic info. So what's your name, your spouse's name, date of birth, and how many kids do you have? Okay. Then guardians, would you like to watch your kids if you and your spouse were to pass away? Okay. And then we do assets. And so this is both who is the executor of your who will be the executor of your will. And this is on the will, and the trust has a couple extra questions. And so who would be the executor? And then where would you like your assets to go? Do you want 50% to go to your child, 50% to go to a charity? Would you like it all to go to your child? Do you like half to go to your spouse, half to your brother? All of those questions. And most people honestly say, give it to my spouse and then give it to my child. And then we have about 8% of everybody, I think it's 8%, give to a charity as well, which is amazing. And so we love that about our product, right? We love that we can connect planned and charitable giving with the causes that people care about. And then the last section is final arrangements. So where would you like to be buried or cremated? And this section, this is such a funny story. In the early days of Trust and Will, we QA'd all of our documents.
Yeah.
And so that means that you have to make sure I read them all. And then I read to make sure that the software was doing the thing that it was supposed to be doing. And somebody's final arrangement, this is, I don't even know if I can share this, but whatever. Somebody's final arrangement was to take their casket and they wanted it to be dipped in wax like a Maker's Mark bottle. I swear, in their will, they said, take my casket and dip it in wax like a Maker's Mark bottle and put it out there for people to see. And I will remember that to this day, because you could put anything in that document. Now, technically, your executor would have to do it at the end of the day, which is hard. And so they might say that's unreasonable. I don't think we're going to do that.
Right.
But anyways, that's the process. If you're doing a trust, there's a couple more questions about who should be your trustee and whether you want conditions for your distributions for your children. So a will, there's not really any conditions. As soon as the will goes into effect, it goes into effect. But a trust, you can create sub-trusts, and those sub-trusts can hold conditions like they don't get their assets until they're 18 or 25, or other conditions that can be put in there.
Yeah. And, to clue everyone listening into, what is a trust?
Yeah. So think about it this way. A trust is like a box. Okay. And you put assets into a trust, and then it has rules attached to who can touch those assets. And so while you're alive, we do revocable living trusts, which means A, they can be revoked, they can be taken away, and B, it means that they're available and immediate while you're living, right? They don't just go into effect afterwards. And so versus an irrevocable trust, which can not be revoked, and once you put stuff in, you can't take them out. So a revocable living trust, think about it as a box. I put assets into it, my box while I'm alive. Okay, I can say and do whatever I want. When I die, it's got rules attached to it. This box goes to my kid, and then it moves from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And there's not an intermediary in there. There doesn't need to be any hands that actually touch the box or transport the box. It just happens. Okay. It happens through the rules of the trust. A will doesn't operate that way. There's no box for the will. A will is just appointment of a person of authority. And so a will says, Daniel, I appoint George to be my executor. And so when I pass away, George now has the authority to then go and distribute the assets.
Yeah.
And so there's a will that combines with the trust all the time. It's called a pour-over will. And so it basically says, George has authority to transfer assets and be my trustee. So he transfers all assets that weren't in the trust, and then the trust gets passed to next of kin. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know one thing too for trust is that there's this reputation that, again, it's for when you have a certain level of wealth. Is that true? Is that what you're seeing?
No, that's not what we're seeing. Well, there is a certain level of wealth, but it is much lower than people would expect it to be.
Yeah.
So
what is it?
When you say a certain level of wealth, you're probably assuming what a lot of people assume, where it's like millions of dollars of wealth before a trust can be valuable. And where we see the value is when you get over the probate threshold in your state. So every state has a different probate threshold. And so what you try to do is you try to keep the probatable assets below your probate threshold, and then you can stay out of the long, arduous, and painful and confusing process of probate. Yeah. And so that threshold is a lot lower than you'd think. I think it changes state by state, but it's less than 200,000 in every state. Okay. And so you think, wow, that's pretty low. And even in California, I think it's 160. And there's very few homes in California that are less than 160. So if you own
Yeah.
a home in California, you're already actually the threshold in every state is basically below the average home price. Like,
Wow.
and so if you own a home, you're basically almost guaranteed to be over the threshold in almost every single state. So that is much lower than the millions and millions of dollars people would assume as a trust fund, where
Right,
people
right.
would first hear about, oh, I have a trust fund. And it's like,
Yeah.
that exists as well,
Yeah.
but it's not the only benefit.
Yeah. That I absolutely love because I think it's so relevant for everybody listening because very much people are at these life milestones. Make sure you know what the probate rules are for the state that you live in because it could really help protect your loved ones.
Yeah.
Daniel, as you think about this next year ahead, what's something that you're really looking forward to for Trust and Will?
Oh man, we have had an amazing run. We have almost doubled the business every single year for the past 4 years. And that goes back to when we were like, the first year you like 10x the business because you go from like nothing to something. And then we basically doubled the business. The magic rule in startups is like, can you triple, double, double, right? And so, we hit like the triple, double, 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 double. And we're trying to do that again this year, right? And so that means that we'll help almost 100,000 families create an estate plan this year, which is just amazing. Like it is absolutely incredible. And they're going to document just an insane amount of assets that are going to be transferring multi-generationally. And so that's 100,000 families. And if you multiply that impact, the average person puts 5.8 unique people in their plan. Okay. So that means that our company this year alone, that product itself will impact more than 500,000 people in the US. So I'm very excited for that sort of scale. I'm excited that we are the largest digital estate planning brand right now, and like focus solely on estate planning. Like technically, LegalZoom does more volume than us, but they're an all things legal platform, right? And so we're the largest version just focused on estate planning. And then the next thing I'm incredibly excited about is the number of financial advisors that we work with now. And we work with over 10,000 financial advisors. We just became the exclusive strategic partner for LPL, meaning that every single LPL financial advisor now has a digital estate planning tool that's approved by their parent company, right? And so I'm really excited for where we're at as a company. I'm excited for the families that we get to impact, and along the way, who knows what will unfold, but it's been an incredible journey so far. So I'm assuming that it'll be challenging, it'll be rewarding, and hopefully impactful.
It's really inspiring to see how many families you're bringing such an affordable service to. So definitely inspiring and also excited to see how much you guys grow in the future as well. To wrap up our podcast today, I had 2 quick lightning round questions. If that sounds good to you?
Yeah, great.
First one, what is a recent purchase up to $100 that has dramatically improved your life?
New golf shoes. I just started golfing and I got new golf shoes and I was like, these are awesome. And so I went on a golf trip and I was like, they improved my life for that golf trip. That's for sure. Probably not like a typical answer, but I don't buy very many things. So, I was very excited about it.
Yeah. And new hobby is always great.
And yeah, new hobby. Like that's what I need right now in my life.
Yeah, for sure. Especially with the third one coming along.
Yeah. You get 3 kids, dog, growing business. I definitely need a new hobby. That's exactly it.
Yeah. And, for you and your relationship, what is one ritual that helps keep you guys healthy?
With my spouse.
Yes, exactly.
So we started doing weekly meetings, and they have been a game changer. They are incredibly helpful. So we've been married 5 years now, and we weren't dating that much. We were only dating for a year before we got married, and so we've done a lot in a short period of time. Had multiple kids, moved states, and so we all of a sudden taken on a bunch more labels and like a bunch more logistics, and a lot of a life happened in a short period of time. And so every Sunday. We don't actually do it every Sunday, but we try to. And but the goal is to get to every Sunday, and we have 4 questions where it's how did you feel loved this week? How did you feel hurt this week? How can I support and pray for you? And then let's look at the logistics of our week. and but we get to the logistics after we talk about the heart stuff, which I think is which is incredibly important, because if we do logistics first, we'll never get to the other stuff. And so our weekly meeting has been really helpful for us to feel like we're on a team and that we're in it together, and then we know how to support each other and how to get better at loving each other.
Absolutely love that. Thank you for both the vulnerability there, as well as a very human answer that is most Sundays, not every single Sunday perfectly. Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast. I'm so excited for more people to understand the nitty-gritty parts about wills and trusts and understand that it's actually for more people than they might even realize. But thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Emily. Bye.